So it's a informal kind of group today. It's only 5 of us. So if there are any questions that come up while I'm talking, feel free to just raise your hand or shout it out. We can turn it into more of a conversation as we go if you wish. That's fine as well. Good. So the talk that I'm giving today is based on a couple of different talks that I've done in the past. Kind of a Frankenstein talk. I was asked by Celebrity Cruise Lines a couple of years ago to design a presentation or a talk on meditation and the art of happiness. So that's basically where this night is coming from, and I've drawn from a couple of other talks that I've done as well. So, meditation and the art of happiness. Well, when I was asked by the cruise line to put this talk together, I had already been meditating for almost 30 years. So I had a pretty good understanding of meditation, or so I thought. Keeps evolving, as you might know already. But I didn't really know how to define or talk about happiness. Seems pretty esoteric in a way. How do you really define happiness? I couldn't really come up with that. So being faced with that dilemma, I went to Google, because that's what you do in the 21st century, right? When you don't know how to define happiness or anything, you ask Google. Google knows. And I found many definitions of happiness, which I'm not going to talk about too much today. But one of the interesting things that I came across in my search was that the American Medical Association also had the same question. They had also set out to try to define happiness. And that was in the mid-90s. They opened a study with therapists and doctors and psychologists to try to define happiness. And what the study brought was that they decided on a definition that happiness is, or could be defined, as a subjective state of joy. Well, what does that mean, right? Subjective state of joy. Well, that still seems very ephemeral in a way. So the definition went on to try to describe what this subjective state of joy might look like in a person's life. And some of that description was the person who was in this subjective state of joy naturally experiences coincidences. Life seems to unfold for them in a way that seems to lead them down a certain path that they're happy with. If they're religious, they might say God was on my side, or the stars were aligned, that type of thing. Coincidences seem to happen for them rather effortlessly. But this study also brought forth a lot of other aspects of happiness. They learned that human beings, on an individual level, have a baseline for happiness, a set point, and that we're born with this baseline for happiness. It seems to be genetic. Now, they didn't prove that scientifically, but that's what the study was pointing to, that this set point for happiness was genetically disposed.
Sorry,
yeah.
That we're all born with the same baseline?
No, it's on an individual level. Yeah, like that. So
You mean some are born with it and some are not?
some are born with can have access to a lot of happiness and joy naturally, and some are born with less of a gift of
You're
that.
talking about material things?
I'm sorry?
Are you talking about material things? That
No.
happiness
No, just some
inside.
people just feel happy naturally, have a natural disposition towards happiness. Those people tend to, as I was saying, life seems to kind of unfold for them. They might seem very lucky. They might get a parking place whenever they wish for one, and so forth, like that. Or they seem to see life, when challenges arise, they see them more as challenges and less as obstacles. People who have a lower set point for that happiness tend to see more of obstacles and less challenges.
So it's something like negative thinking, when your mind is
Yes.
fix that button.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. Good. So the study showed that there are certain techniques that we can do to raise that baseline for happiness. That was one of the questions. They decided, well, if this is a genetic disposition, then what's the point? Why even bother trying to be happy if we're already at a certain baseline at birth? So they looked at 5 different techniques that human beings often use to try to be happier. And I'll go through all 5 of them before, and the last one is meditation, so that's coming, don't worry. But the first one they looked at is cognitive therapy. Cognitive therapy. Cognitive?
It's about the mind.
Yeah.
Process.
Yeah. And I'll explain what that is actually. So, say a person has a distorted view of reality, some sort of distortion. A good example is maybe an anorexic. They look in the mirror, and although they're very, very thin, they see that their body is fat, right? So that's a distorted view of reality.
Can I take notes, Chris? Can I take
Yeah,
notes?
sure. I'd be flattered. So a cognitive therapist will go in and try to correct that view of reality, so their view of reality will more accurately reflect real life. So a cognitive therapist will help an anorexic, using that example, to more accurately see their body, more accurately have a more accurate image of what their body looks like. And that's cognitive therapy. And what these studies showed was that cognitive therapy can increase our baseline for happiness. So it can increase our potential for happiness.
Sorry,
So-
what was the term you used? Cognitive?
Therapy?
We used another word
Did I?
earlier. Yeah, other than therapy.
Cognitive therapy? No, I don't think so. I'll check the video later and I'll let you know. The second thing that the topic that these therapists and psychologists looked at was our life circumstances. Life circumstances? The things that happen in our day-to-day life. For example, let's say you're going along in your life, everything's as normal, and maybe you experience a great loss. You have an accident, a family member passes away, or something like that. You lose your job, something that causes great loss. You might dip below that baseline, that set point for happiness, but eventually you recover and you regain and you return back to that set point for happiness. It's good news, right? Fortunately, we have that recovery process, yeah. But it works the other way too. If you're going through your life and let's say you get married or you have a child or you win the lottery, you might rise up from that set point for happiness for however long, 6 months or a year, but eventually you return back to that same baseline for happiness. So what they learned through that study is that our life circumstances doesn't really change our set point for happiness, our potential for our happiness. The third topic that they looked at was our day-to-day choices, the choices that we make every day that give us pleasure. Going to see a movie, or going for a slice of pizza or a cup of coffee, giving a talk. And what they learned was that these day-to-day choices, while they may give us a little spark of pleasure, it's very short-lived, and it doesn't really affect our baseline for happiness. The fourth topic they looked at was fulfillment. And what fulfillment means here is finding fulfillment by helping others.
Again?
By helping others. And this study showed that we actually can increase our baseline for happiness by helping others find happiness. It's wonderful.
Service.
Yes, service to others. That's a wonderful lesson there. So if you want to be happy, you help other people be happy. If you want to be successful, you can help other people be successful. It's wonderful. And then the fifth topic is meditation that they looked at. And these studies showed that a healthy, consistent meditation practice does raise our potential for happiness. So that's how it ties into the talk. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Buddha, because that's where my training is, about the Buddha. Not as a religious figure, but as a human being and as a meditation teacher. So I'm not here to try to convert anyone to Buddhism. It's not my goal.
Are you Buddhist?
I used to be. I'm not sure if I am anymore or not. Yeah, yeah.
Buddha is actually the enlightened one, right?
That's what the Buddha means. Enlightened
So it's
one.
not religion, it's like enlightened. So I think that's okay.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah. Good. So when the Buddha set out on his journey, his quest, which brought him to his awakening experience, he had this question: what is suffering, and how do we resolve this problem of suffering? And he took that question to the problem-solving model that was really common for medics and doctors in ancient India in 5th century BC. And that model was, what is the problem? And they still use this in India today, actually. You're familiar, right? Yeah, what is the problem? What is the cause of the problem? Is there a solution to this problem? And how do we apply this solution? And that brought the Buddha to the Four Noble Truths, his answer to suffering through this prism, if you will, this problem-solving model. And for him, the answer was, well, the problem is that life contains suffering, or dukkha. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Sanskrit word dukkha, because it's a really tricky translation. Many translators have struggled for years to try to translate dukkha. So I'll talk a little bit about that. We suffer because we react emotionally to life. We live life in a knee-jerk reaction with our emotions, like that. So any kind of discomfort, we push away through some habitual, ingrained method, whether it's drugs or sex or alcohol or music or even something healthy like meditation or exercise. But often and unfortunately it's done in an unconscious way. And so that leads to suffering. That unconsciousness leads to suffering. The third aspect of the Four Noble Truths, which I like to call the four tasks, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The third aspect is the Pali word or Sanskrit word is nirodha, and that is the ceasing of the suffering. And we can stop that emotional reactivity. That's what the Buddha pointed to. It's like we don't need to react emotionally to the discomforts of life. We can embrace the discomforts of life. And there's great relief in that. And the fourth of the four is called the marga, or the path, the life, which we cultivate in order to release that emotional side.
What is it?
Marga, it's cultivating a lifestyle where we don't have to react emotionally to our discomfort any longer.
Cultivate the lifestyle.
A lifestyle.
It's like the lifelong diet. like the style of living.
Yeah, and actually, he actually outlined 8 different topics or aspects. I'll give those right now. Understanding. Well, I like to use, traditionally it's translated as right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right attention, right concentration, and right meditation. Now I find the translation right problematic, because that brings up the duality of right versus wrong.
Correct is correct
correct is better. I like the translation complete.
Complete.
Yeah, which that brings up, it leads to more of a mindfulness practice. So if you think complete livelihood, complete thought, complete action.
So no duality in that.
No duality in that translation of complete.
What about conscious?
Conscious or mindful? Mindful is an accurate translation as well.
So that's marga.
That's the path. Is cultivating these eight, bringing mindfulness rather to these eight aspects of everyday life. And that it's actually, that's not the end game. It's a cycle. That as we cultivate a lifestyle that allows us to unplug from our emotional reactivity, then we see that dukkha, we can embrace dukkha more completely, because it doesn't scare us any longer. Then that allows us to rest more openly, which actually brings up more intense dukkha, unfortunately, but that's how it works. That's again the second of the four. And then the third, we unplug from that more intense emotional reactivity. And then the fourth, we get deeper into the lifestyle because we see how effective that lifestyle has become. We then embrace more, we apply more mindfulness to those eight aspects. So it becomes this cycle like that. So it's not that you start at one and you end at four. It's a constant cycle.
You said that you actually, as you go through this cycle, you have more and more dukkha, right?
Mm-hmm.
You just said that.
Well,
So-
it's not more and more dukkha, but you become more receptive or more open, so that you feel the discomfort more deeply, but it bothers you less. That makes sense.
Dukkha meaning is pain, suffering.
That's
So
the
how-
literal translation. I'm going to talk
That's the
about
topic
that.
I know.
Yeah,
Indian side
yeah,
of the
sure.
meaning.
Yeah.
That's what the meaning is, but how does it, the one you are explaining, how does it come in the,
Okay.
how do you put it?
The four tasks.
Yeah, for us.
My question was because I talk about this in energy healing, that the more we clean our energy systems, the more the universe gives us challenges to take on that are actually increasingly big challenges because we can handle it.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering if it's the same thing.
It is the same thing, just verbalized differently. But yes,
yeah,
that's
no,
absolutely,
it's really interesting. that it's the
absolutely
same thing.
correct. Yeah. So addressing that point of dukkha, well, luckily for us, one of the Buddha's earliest students, Ananda, had that same question. And he asked that question. It's recorded in the text, luckily. He said, what do you mean by dukkha? And the Buddha said, well, dukkha is birth, dukkha is aging, dukkha is sickness, dukkha is death, dukkha is not getting what one wants, dukkha is getting what one doesn't want, dukkha is being separated from those who are dear, and dukkha is being close to those who aren't dear. So really, when taking that definition into account, dukkha is really life, right? Birth is life. Sickness, well, that's life. We all get sick. Right? We all age. We all die. That's life. We all have experiences where we didn't get what we wanted, right? And we have experiences being separated from those who are dear. So for me, that reading of dukkha from the original text is really a real call to embrace life, to embrace the human condition as deeply as possible. So we do that in meditation. And when you sit to meditate, you follow the breath, and then you're sitting with the body, inevitably discomfort arises, right? If you've even meditated for a few minutes, you probably have felt some sort of discomfort in the body that you didn't notice it was there. If you meditate deeply, sometimes emotional discomforts will arise. That's very common if you have a deep meditation practice. So we watch that discomfort arise. That's the first truth. We embrace it. We don't push it away. But we don't cling to it either. We just let it come. Just let the experience arise. That's the first of the 4 tasks. The second of the 4 tasks is to recognize that arising. Okay, this is what it is. We can see our emotional reaction to it, but we don't indulge in it. We just let it be there. That's the second of the 4. The third of the 4 is the ceasing. Now, that arising will also pass. That's nature. Everything that arises passes. Right? That's the natural way of life. And it's the same with our discomfort. It's the same thing with our dukkha. Every dukkha that arises will stay for a while, and if it's an intense dukkha, it'll pretend to be very important, and we'll try to want to push it away. But the idea is to rest, just to rest. Allow that resting quality to be there, and to sit with that discomfort. And then it will fade. Now, when that fading happens, there's a space that opens up. Could be a space in the heart. Some people feel it in the abdomen or behind the eyes. But it's a space that opens up. And it's this real sense of peace that occurs. That's the embracing the third task, or really discovering and knowing that feeling, what that feels like. Because that's what's going to bring us to cultivate a lifestyle which brings more of that. Because it really feels wonderful. And that's nirvana. That's what the Buddha said. This is nirvana. This is that ceasing of our emotional reactivity. That's nirvana. Nirvana isn't some heavenly, far-off state that's only attainable for monks that meditate 8 hours a day and practice celibacy and don't eat meat. No, nirvana is available for all of us, all the time, in every moment. But we just have to be able to rest in whatever discomfort arises. Now, the reason why this is so applicable to meditation is because we're not doing anything else. We're just sitting, right? And so we can just sit and see that discomfort, see that dukkha arise. And then we can just practice letting it go. So you're sitting, the foot falls asleep, the ache in the back starts, the mind is going, oh, I hope I don't get caught in traffic on the way home or caught in the rain. That would be terrible. And, whatever is arising, or it could be happy thoughts too. We sometimes cling to the bliss that arises in meditation, but we should let that go as well. That's the teaching, is to let anything that arises just pass. Okay? And I always see it as an arc. And for me, it comes here in my mind's eye. I can see it come that way, and then pass through it. And then it fades, and then another one comes up. And it's not a problem anymore. When you practice that, when you sit in meditation, cultivate that resting quality that meditation can bring, the dukkha is no longer a problem. Now that's where the challenges come in. Because it so often feels like a problem. We're always happy to accept anything except this, right? Except what? Yeah.
Isn't it the dukkha connected to when you have expectations? Sometimes, you expect, always, I think the pain is when you're expecting and you don't get it, then the pain arises.
Well, not getting what one wants. Sure.
Yes.
Sure.
So expectation is there, the dukkha is there. So when desires, yeah.
Sure.
So once it stops, I think the dukkha disappears by itself, right?
Well, we don't, in this practice, or the way I've come to understand meditation, is we don't want to repress anything.
Yeah.
And expectations is a part of the human condition. Not getting what one wants is a part of the human condition. And we need to be able to honor that. And so that's why the resting is so important. Because if you can cultivate that resting quality, it's very subtle. Things arise, like expectations, for example, or desires, craving arises. And we often just say, oh, not now. But as soon as we enter that not now mind, we're not resting any longer. And that it can be so subtle, it can be so delicate in a way, because as soon as you say not now, you're pushing away, and so that pushing has brought us out of the resting state, like that. But also craving too, or grasping, like when bliss arises. Oftentimes meditators experience bliss. I know I do. It's wonderful. It's wonderful, and that bliss can really power a meditation practice. But to cling to it, that clinging brings us out of the resting state. And so to be able to just rest and allow whatever arises to pass as it will normally. So when I like the example of, well, take the example of walking on a beach, right? You're walking maybe hand in hand with somebody you love, or just alone, listening to the sound of the waves and the sun is setting. In that moment, there's no craving, there's no ego, right? You can just be at peace in that moment. But then the mind says, oh, I wish this would last forever, right? And in that moment, there's craving. And that takes you out of that nirvana. It takes you out of that nirvanic experience. So in meditation, we learn to cultivate resting very, very deeply. Not doing anything. I love it because meditation is really the art of not doing anything at all. But when you pose it that way, it seems so easy, right? But it's arguably the most challenging thing to do, is to not completely do nothing. It's very, very challenging because that includes thinking. That includes pushing away and grasping, not doing anything else.
In that you lose track of time. You feel it's just 15 minutes, but when you open your eyes, it's already 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Even though you're not doing anything, you lose track of time.
Yeah.
Meditation, right?
Can do. It does happen that way.
It does happen.
You slip into a timeless
I
state.
lose track. In my mind, okay, it's only just 10 minutes. When I open my eyes, oh, it's already 45 minutes. Okay, I have work to do.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
It's wonderful. It sounds like you have a very healthy meditation
Oh,
practice.
yes, I've been doing for years.
Good. Yeah. So much benefit. Yeah. So then, the reason why we do this resting, we practice resting in meditation, is so that we can come to life with that resting quality. So that we're familiar, when we sit in meditation, we become familiar with our emotional reactivity. We meditate, and sometimes we're sitting and, that argument the other day, and anger starts arising in the gut and in the shoulders. I should have said this, and I can't believe they did that to me. And you're seeing that in the silence of meditation. When that happens over and over again, you become very comfortable with your own anger, with what your anger feels like. As you let it arise and you pass, you don't grasp at it, you don't push it away. Maybe sometimes you sit for 45 minutes. That's okay. That's what it was, But the more you have that experience without indulging in it, or without pushing it away either, the more comfortable you become with your own anger. So then when life happens and you're driving and somebody cuts you off on the road, or the other day at the airport, I mentioned this, they tried to charge me twice for my carry-on, or for my checked luggage and things like that. When these little life circumstances happen, anger will still arise. That's natural. Anger is a part of the human condition. We're not here to give ourselves a spiritual lobotomy. So we allow the anger to arise. But now we've sat in meditation, we've sat in silence, we've experienced this anger over and over again. And so when that anger arises, we just see it as another part of the experience. Now it's no longer something that takes us out of where we are, takes us out of the present moment. And generally, if we haven't had a meditation practice where we can experience this, anger arises and we collapse down on the anger. We become the anger. It's even in our language, right? I am so angry, right? So we become that anger. And then we habitually react. That's the second of the 4 tasks. We fall into that habitual reaction. We flip the driver off, or we punch the person out, or however we've behaved in the past will dictate how we react to that feeling of anger in our body. So that's karma. It becomes our habitual reaction, like that. If we can.
Again, karma?
That's karma. Our habitual reaction. That's karma. So our past, the way we've reacted to the feelings of anger in our body, how that feels in our body, whether it's yelling or screaming, or some people shut down, or they slam a door and they storm off, or however we've dealt with that sensation of that emotion in our body, that dictates how we will continue dealing with that, unless we can experience it. A meditation practice helps us release that karma, helps us release that habit, so we can experience the anger without doing habitual escape.
So experience the anger in daily life, or we can experience it during the meditation and release it? What?
You practice, you come to a meditation practice, and sometimes anger arises. I'm just using anger as an example. Sometimes anger arises during the meditation. Now, if you can sit and rest in that experience of the anger arising, you become more comfortable with what that sensation feels like in your body. An emotion is nothing but the body's reaction to your thoughts. That's what an emotion is. Every emotion has a sensation in the body, gives rise to a corresponding sensation in the body. So when you feel that anger arise, if you haven't felt that in the silence of meditation, then you will react habitually, however you've reacted in the past. It will happen again and again and again and again. Every time you feel that sensation, it reinforces itself. It's a cycle. That's karma. So this meditation practice allows us to step off that cycle. It allows us to experience the anger very deeply in a resting way, so that when that anger arises, it almost acts like a reminder. Oh, I can rest with this. Yeah, I've done this before. And then you rest. Then you respond in a different way. Maybe if a person's yelling at you and you feel that sensation of anger arising, you don't punch them out or yell back, but you say, oh, I can see you're really upset. Can I help you with something? Is there something I can do to help you alleviate this? You can respond with compassion rather than reacting out of anger. Yeah.
Anger connected to ego then?
Oh,
Ego,
sure.
It shows that why we are angry when you say something to me and I get angry. So it's ego again.
Yes,
So
sure.
all the anger, I think, is connected to ego.
Yeah.
Like your baggage arrived. It didn't really your baggage didn't arrive. So it's again, it comes to ego, mind, this thing.
Sure.
Right?
Yes.
All the anger. So when you have no ego, no anger.
The ego there.
The ego is. I don't think. I think it's a myth that we can get rid of the ego. I think the ego, from the way I've come to understand it, and I know there are many people who might disagree with that, but.
Not disagree, but practice the way we practice. As you said, meditation really helps, and it does help. It does help. 90% of your anger disappears in that meditation.
Well, in the way I've come to understand it, I don't think the anger disappears, but we learn to embrace it.
Embrace it, yeah.
And it's the same with the ego. I don't think the ego ever disappears, but we learn to embrace it.
Embrace it.
We become friends with the ego, like that. So we change, our relationship to our ego changes.
The way
Yeah.
we see it.
Yeah. I know that there are early texts of the Buddha that talk about these arhats, in Theravada Buddhism in particular, that it says that they've cut off their desire like one would cut a palm tree. And I don't think, like one would cut a palm tree.
Yeah.
I don't think that's really possible. It's not, I don't think it's really,
I didn't get it.
like one would cut down a tree.
Yeah.
That's how these early Buddhist monks are said to have cut out their desire. But it seems...
It means like if we cut out the ego,
Right,
desire,
right.
like cut out the tree. So it means if you grow up there.
Well, if you cut down a tree doesn't grow again. It's just a stump, and that's it. The tree is dead.
So it
And
not
so-
grow again. What
Well, that's just it. I don't think that's really desire, ego, anger. It's a part of our DNA. It's why we've survived as human species. You know, we're designed to feel anger anytime we feel threatened. That's a natural response. We feel threatened, we're going to feel anger. And so that's healthy. Now the idea is to befriend that feeling of anger so that we can unplug our emotional reactivity to it. The anger arises and we feel the sensation wherever, in our gut, in our shoulders, in our headache sometimes. The anger comes, we feel maybe in our throat, very fiery, hot, right? But if we're familiar with it and we've sat and we've rested with it over and over again, hour after hour or day after day, however long you meditate, it could be just 15 minutes a day, but it's enough to become familiar with your internal, whatever's happening internally, then you learn to rest in that. So you're no longer causing suffering to other people for your own feelings. You take responsibility for your feelings. Yeah.
I understand the idea of when you're experiencing a strong emotion like anger, you sit with it. But did you earlier say that unless you deal with that, like it has to arise during a practice so that you'll be able to deal with it outside of the practice? Because do you see the difference?
Well, I think in my own case, speaking personally, it would be very difficult to rest in the sensations that anger bring if I hadn't experienced it in the meditation practice.
Right, but there are two scenarios. There's like the one scenario is when you're angry, then you sit with it. The other one, I thought you were saying is that you sit in meditation like now, and the anger arises like out of the blue. And I don't think I've experienced that.
Well, you might,
So that's-
because
okay.
yeah, that happens. We often store anger in our muscles, in our body, when we experience anger in our day. And the reason is that because we don't process it right away. So that anger has to go somewhere. And generally we repress it into our body. And so when we do meditation, particularly if you're doing a body scanning type of meditation, anger arises or some intense emotions. But also, like the example I gave, this happens to me sometimes, just from like an argument that I might have had. I'll sit and I start to replay the argument, because when you sit in silence, really the mind doesn't really want to be silent. It'll find any excuse to keep going, right? So situations throughout the day or throughout the week or the month that gave rise to anger are great fodder for the mind to keep running over and over again during a meditation practice. And I think that does bring up the sensations. For me personally, I've had that many times where the sensations of anger arise during a meditation practice.
Because remember on Monday, I told you we did the body scan, and then my whole neck and shoulders started feeling more tense than before.
Right.
So I was really, is that a way of processing anger? Like, so
It could
my
be.
body was tensing up, and my mind was actually okay. I didn't have thoughts of violence or anything, but I just felt like, so maybe
Yeah.
is that a form of
There's a way you can, only you could really answer that question. If that feels like what anger has felt like to you in the past, probably that was what that was your body was processing that.
Because at the time I didn't know, but now that you're talking about it, I'm thinking maybe that was anger being processed
Sure.
by the body.
Could be. You can do this in a practice, actually. If you go into a meditation, just follow the breath and maybe do a body scanning. The body scanning really helps bring up the emotion.
I will share my experience.
Let me just finish this practice really quick, outline this practice. So if you rest in meditation 10, 15 minutes, feeling the breath in the body, and then just call up in your mind's eye some incident that brought up anger.
So you deliberately go there.
You deliberately go there, and you bring up the anger, and then practice resting with it. Practice resting. That resting quality is so important. So then, and yeah, it's like it's almost like, I don't know if you know baseball, but you know, if you're a baseball batter who's before they go to bat, they'll swing 2 bats to warm up. You know, to make and so when they get to bat, the bat is very light. It's almost like that kind of scenario. We go into the meditation and we really go into that anger and really dive into it, so we know it intimately, and learn how to rest in that at the same time, and then come out of it. Now, when you come out of a practice like that, you don't want to just stop and say, okay, that's enough, I'm done, on with my day, because then you'll carry that anger with you. That's not healthy either. So what you'd want to do is maybe if you have a half an hour, do the body scanning for maybe 10 minutes, sit with the anger for 10 minutes, and then do another body scanning for 10 minutes to really cleanse the energy
Are we
of
doing
that
that
anger.
under
No, I wasn't planning on it, but we can if you wish.
training?
I take requests. Sure, that would be fine. Yeah.
Oh, super fun. Anger?
Not fun, not fun. These practices are by no, they're fine. Yeah.
I thought you said fun.
No. No, these practices are far from fun and quite challenging
Yeah.
often. Yeah.
You said we sit with the under 10 minutes?
You can do, if you have a half an hour, I recommend sitting to get into the meditation for 10 minutes, allowing the mind to rest, feeling the body. Then for 10 minutes, allowing the anger to arise, using your imagination to see some instance where you felt anger.
But I think when the under come up and we sit, how we know that like in 10 minutes and we stop and
Set a timer.
Timer.
Set a
but,
timer.
I think just like it stop at the under and that is good for us, or we need to only observe the breathing, let it go
Good.
completely and
Good
after that
question.
finish.
Yeah, so the technique there, I'm glad you brought that up. While you're resting with the breath in the body, you allow the anger to arise. You don't go completely into the anger. You don't indulge in it, as I said. You don't repress it either, but you allow it to be there. Now, if you just allow the anger to rest there, you still feel the breath in the body. You're still maintaining awareness in the breath in the body. And that's very important, because if you go all the way into the anger, then you're just going to fuel that anger. You're just going to sit there and go, I can't believe they did that to me. That's not helpful. But oftentimes, the breath and body can feel really nice. So we just let the anger come, and that's enough of that, and we come back to the breath in the body, and we leave the anger go. That's not helpful either. So for 10 minutes, you sit in the experience of the body, the breath, and the anger all at the same time. So holding it all together as one experience. Thich Nhat Hanh actually has a teaching on this, where he says you hold the anger the way a mother would hold a newborn baby. Yeah, beautiful imagery there. So delicate. Yeah, embrace it. But so very delicate, very lightly, holding that anger. And yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes, I want to ask is like we wait for the anger grow completely, and after that we finish, or we stop, like, or it's time to stop.
It's up to you, however much time you have for the practice. This practice is really about learning what our emotions feel like. It's not about resolving our wounds. Leave that to therapy. Therapy is really good for that, to resolving old wounds. Meditation can do that, and I've had that experience many times as well. But really, the point of this practice is to use our previous wounds to know what our emotions feel like on a very intimate level, so that we can unplug that emotional reactivity when those wounds become triggered in the present moment. Like that. Is that?
This is different from the practice where you can also befriend your fear. Like when the children talked about one where your fear is like a big scary monster, and then you kind of come face to face to it and feel their breath on you. And is it different?
Yes, it's similar.
It's similar.
Yeah, it's similar to that. Fear is just another one of those very powerful. I kind of stray away from using negative or positive. You know, it's part of the human condition. You know, so fear arises naturally. It's again why we've survived as human beings. We learned to run from the tiger. so you know, fear arises. That is what happens as human beings. We experience fear, but if we follow that fear, if we become that fear, if we say, "I am so scared," so much poison comes into the body from the mind. You know, this fight or flight mechanism, which floods the body with endorphins or with these hormones that we don't need. You know, if we're, I don't know, scared of flying, for example. It's such an unnecessary fear, right? We get on the plane and we sit down and we start to feel the engine, and our whole body fills with this fear, and this hormone floods our body and our muscles. It's so unhealthy for us, and it creates such discomfort. And then we sit in that discomfort, and the stewardess comes and says, "Are you okay?" And you're like, "Ah!" Or if that is the habit, if your habit is to react in that way to that fear, then that's what will happen. So yeah, we learn, we see, as Pema says, to see it as a monster, to feel the breath of that monster. But I think she resolves it by embracing, right, the monster, befriending. Yeah, it's very powerful.
And is it okay if you only have 15 minutes, you can do 5, 5, 5?
It is. That's a little short for that type of practice, I would
It's
say.
advanced, no? It's kind of
It is. It
advanced.
is. It is. You want to. There are three things you need for this type of practice: capacity for attention, willingness, and know-how. Well, the willingness is obviously there for yourself. If you're willing to sit with your discomfort, that's the willingness. Capacity is what we do in basic shamatha meditation, basic following the breath meditation. I'll talk a little bit about that since we haven't yet. And then know-how. And that's what I'm hopefully giving you all today, is a little bit of know-how. That's what I give my students. Yeah.
One more question. Okay,
Sure.
we're talking about anger and about the fear, but how about, let's say, positive sides, like when you, I'm proud of myself, the best, and the, like, this is also this
Yes.
very, very strong feelings.
Yes.
So we're dealing with them too,
Yes.
yeah?
Absolutely.
So is it works the same way?
It works exactly the same way with every. Okay, so there are. I'll just address that really quick, and then I'll talk about the basic building capacity that I was talking about. There are 5 emotions that don't reinforce the ego. Do not reinforce the ego. 4 are known as the 4 immeasurables, and then there's a 5th one that I'll talk about. But they're loving kindness. That doesn't reinforce the ego. There's no ego when you feel loving kindness for another being or an animal. Compassion. There's no ego in compassion. joy or sympathetic joy, as it's known as, where you feel happy for somebody else's happiness. There's no ego in that. And equanimity. Equanimity, the ability to see people or situations without judgment. There's no ego in equanimity. And the fifth is devotion. Devotion. And that comes into play where you feel devoted to a particular guru or a teacher or a faith or a practice. This sense of devotion, that has no ego in it either.
It's like respect.
Dedication
to something.
Yeah.
You're giving your life
You
for
Okay. It's like in the plane. When you sit in the plane, so I give my life to
No,
the
no.
Slightly different. It's more like devotion is more like giving your life to a higher power, or to in some practices
Even
it's
in prayers.
in
Devotion,
prayer.
Yeah, it's devotion prayers.
Yeah,
Devotion.
like that. Yeah. So that has no ego. But any other emotion that arises has some sort of form of egoic base to it, some form of potential to reinforce the ego. So yes, pride or envy, anything like that. Those types of emotions, selfishness, that type of thing. Those all reinforce the ego and can be wonderful tools for meditation. You can learn to rest in any of that. And it's good if you can look over your life patterns, maybe the past 10 years of your life, where the challenges have arrived. You know, what circumstances in your life have brought difficulties or challenges into your life, and what emotions are surrounding those challenges. Those emotions are the ones that are really good for you to practice with. Because it's no coincidence that those challenges have arrived when those emotions were present. It sometimes seems those emotions arise because of the challenges, but I question that. I think sometimes the challenges arise because of our emotional reactivity to certain challenges. Life always gives us circumstances from which we can grow, right? And so when those circumstances come, we have certain emotional reactivity to those circumstances. And those are the emotions that we can use for practice. It's really great practice material.
Here's 5 emotions is according to the Buddha. Is it in the sutras or is it according to
It is.
American
Well, no. Both. They coincide actually. But the Buddha did say point to the 4 immeasurables, or he called it the 4 abodes, the 4 resting places of the gods, as it's known in Hinduism too, actually. Loving kindness, sympathetic joy, compassion, and equanimity. Actually, if you see the 4 heads of Brahman, that's what the 4 heads of Brahman symbolize. Loving kindness, joy,
So
equanimity.
devotion is missing.
Devotion came a little later in Buddhism, came around the 8th century AD in Tibetan Buddhism. We started to see the practice of devotion as one of the immeasurables, or as a way of cultivating a high level of attention through devotion.
Devotion arose when people were becoming more religious.
Yeah.
That's how the devotion started. Right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And one more thing about the anger. Doesn't it help when you give affirmation? In my case, it does help me when I'm sitting down. Every day I cannot sit 45 minutes. Sometimes it's just 5 minutes of meditation, sometimes it's not. But the day I sit, I release my anger, giving affirmation. So it really helps. So why do we bring it up when we can release it out?
Well, in this practice that I was referring to, I mentioned bringing it up so as a way that we can become intimate with what anger feels like.
But doesn't it stay with you that for a long time?
Well, that's why you do the body scanning at the end, to learn to release that energy back from where it came. And if you do sit with it long enough, it does unravel. It does become released. You'll know that it's released when you can visualize that same incident that you were using for the practice, but there's no more anger. You see the incident and you just rest, and you don't feel the anger any longer. And that's how you know that it's unraveled, that it's that situation is gone. It's no more charge left. But yeah, I understand your question, I think, and it's unusual to want to do that. The reason
like,
is
like suppose if I'm angry with you, I'll sit down, I'll say, I release all my anger, and I'm not judging anymore. It's your way of saying it. You're right in your own way, I'm right in my own way.
Oh, sure.
So I release it. Of course, you're right in your own way. You will feel you're right. I will feel I'm right.
Right.
So we both are right. Nobody's wrong.
Right.
So I take it that way and I release my anger. Okay. I really then see you the way I used to see you before.
Mm.
Doesn't it help?
I think that sounds like it helps for you. It sounds like it's very beneficial for you. But in the way that I teach and practice,